Welcome, folks. So, for today's little presentation, this is a sneak preview of what that's going to look like. You can see lots of mountain pictures here that I took when I lived in Arizona. And just because I don't live there doesn't mean I'm still connected to the place because this is my ancestral homeland and it's also where I grew up. So, it's really just, I could even get a homicide lease there and have it signed off. So now that I'm old enough to do that. But this is me. It's a nice historical photo of me as a baby in a Navajo cradle board made by my relatives. And I'm laying here actually on the lap of one of my aunts. It's my auntie. She is, let me see. It's my aunt. I have an aunt. I have a blood auntie, related to me by blood, and she married this man, and so through my auntie, this man is my uncle. So that's my aunt and my uncle, and then this new uncle has a sister, and that sister is therefore my auntie. I don't know how to call that in English, but and because on the Navajo tribe we don't use English terms for these kind of family relationships. We usually stick with Navajo terms. So anyhow, hopefully that makes sense. That's who this is. It's my aunt, one of my aunts. And then there's another picture of me there as a baby in the mountains. This is what it looks like where I live. This is my backyard area. Nice wooded area behind my house. And then, yeah, these pictures here that I'm showing, I actually borrowed this from one of my friends who lives in the same area. So that's why I'm showing it. But the rest of these pictures, I took these pictures myself. What you're looking at here are pictures in Utah because I went to a university in Utah, and they have mountains there as well. It's all part of the Rocky Mountain Range. And then this is the area where I grew up. This is considered Red Valley. If you go further north to where I live, actually, it's called Oak Springs. In Navajo, we call it Sech Iliatjo. So that's this place up here. This mountain here is called Carrizo Mountain, and this mountain peak that I'm standing on in this photo is actually called Roof Butte, which is part of the Chusca Mountain Range. There you go. So this is essentially my homeland, and there you go. They're not all of these are the best photos, as you can see, and I usually get around on these mountains with my bicycle. I also have a F-150 that I drive around from time to time. I don't think I have a picture of the F-150 in this gallery. But yeah, and then there's a picture of my grandmother. I talk about her a lot because she was a big part of my life. But a lot of the gear that I'm going to talk about in the presentation, a lot of these tools, basically I learned through doing carpentry and also living in the mountains, taking care of myself, because my grandma that is shown here, she died in a vehicle accident when I was 16, and then I started living by myself when I was 16, and I was given an option to leave the tribe possibly, or live somewhere outside of the mountains as a 16-year-old, and I didn't want to leave, and I said I'd rather stay in the mountains, and it's more peaceful there, and I want to continue living there. And that's what I did up until my early 20s. So, thankfully, the tribe or anybody really did not have any problems with that. I would say if this happened outside of the tribe, outside of the Navajo tribe here in America, then they would probably have some issues with it, most likely, because there are laws that say you cannot leave people under 18 by themselves in terms of living. You can't have them live by themselves. There's likely different laws like that for certain kind of states. Where I live specifically, that's not required. Fortunately, in my case, when that happened. So uh, on the fortunate side, I was at least given an opportunity to take care of myself. So that's what I did. And then this is a picture of me, my grandma, and I standing in in front of this waterfall. This is north of Durango, Colorado, and they have nice waterfalls out there. They got nice places, so we took pictures like this out there. So these are the only pictures I could find that I have brought with me from Arizona. And then yeah, the rest of these places here, they're just around my house, behind my backyard and all. So that's what that's like. So yeah, we even have grass. We got grass in Arizona. You wouldn't think that there would be grass in places like this, but there is. It's not everywhere. It just kind of pops up in random places. So there you go. So with that in mind, I actually want to show that there is a list of gear that we need to consider for these kind of situations when you live by yourself. So that's why I call it Onri's Basic Gear for Survival or Living Alone. And then uh, I just write it here. This is my experience, extensive experience of living in the mountains. So these are also things that we think about in terms of medical care as well. So I may make some comments about that because there's no there's no clinic, there's no hospital nearby, and if you hurt yourself, you must learn to quickly take care of it and treat yourself. And if it really gets that bad, then you may have to call for help or get somewhere, find a way to a hospital. The closest hospital from where I live is about maybe a 40 to 45-minute drive to the east of where I live. Yeah. So you'd have to drive pretty quickly. And that has actually happened to me. One time when I was a kid, I was doing some carpentry work, and a this blade actually cut my hand, and it wasn't that bad per se. It wasn't like ripping through my bone or anything, but it did rip through a chunk of my finger, you see, and also part of my fingernail. It was part of a saw blade, but the thing is lots of blood coming out of my finger, and I felt like there was heat coming out of my finger. But in that case, we kind of wrapped it up, and we actually traveled to the hospital. We drove like, yeah, 40 45 minutes to get there. And in that case, yes, it's pretty extreme. But in other cases, uh, something less worse than that, you know, smaller cuts where you're not bleeding out everywhere, then it's better. It's most likely better to take care of yourself. And then it could be worse. There are places where you could be in the mountains, but it's not easy to drive through the area, or you might be stranded by lots of water that has flowed through the area from the heavy rains or from the heavy snow that has melted, say in spring. We don't really get mudslides where I live, so thankfully there's that. And the reason why that is because it's a very rocky place. There's rocks on the solid ground itself. Even my house is built on solid rock. So we fortunately never had to worry about dealing with anything concerned with mudslides or anything like that. So I understand that there are other places around the world where people experience mudslides, and that's because the foundation of the area or the region is not as rocky or as stable to the core. So at least where I live, the rocks go deep, deep down into the earth. There's likely a giant like an underground chandelier of just rock that goes deep into the earth, and that's what that's pretty much what it's like out there. Generally, in the Rocky Mountain range, that's what it's like. It's really just heavy, deep rock, and that that goes deep into the crust of the earth. So, in other places, not so much. You'd have to really study geology more in depth to find out what that's like, to see whether or not a place is more stable in terms of the geological formations and such, so that it's not prone to like mudslides and things like that. Anyhow, so and then radios and lasers, I will talk about that here as well, and then some notes about improvised tools. This roadmap that I'm showing is really just kind of a list as we go through the presentation. There are 63 slides, but I would say let's not worry too much about the number of slides, because I will really just kind of give an overview as we go through these, and it will go item by item. So I would call this kind of like a capability stack, and this capability stack is something that comes in 3 layers. There's something you can carry in your pockets, your pants pockets, shirt pockets, jacket pockets, whatever. And these would be things like pens, maybe a flashlight, for example, like this, or even a spare battery. So I have a spare battery here. I'll talk about this in a bit. Talk about that, about the features, maybe gloves, and then there's the home base. There's a longer list, but this really talks about the primary tools that you would not normally carry around with you every day, but there are tools that you could use. Batteries here might be the exception, because there are some batteries you could carry with you, but not all batteries are necessarily portable. Some of them, they're kind of too big to fit in the pocket, so that's why that's listed here. And then let's see, field modules are something you could carry, let's say in a toolbox, for example. Even though you might not necessarily carry a toolbox everywhere you go in the wilderness, but you may probably carry a toolbox with you if you're going to do some field work, working on a fence, working on, let's say, on a little farm you have, or doing something like that in the backyard. When I say in the backyard, it's just like this big open area in the woods. So something like that. Or maybe doing some hiking or traveling. That would also fall under that field module category. And then this right here, this tree is really just sort of a cheat sheet of the tools. Howdy. And then the tools themselves are really about, I would say, 7 different categories or so, such as wearables, hand tools, ropes, lights in that regard, the food and thermal, the health modules, the power, which is including the battery packs that I was mentioning, and some more heavier duty tools that we'll talk about. So, and then these are really just kind of like the approaches for solving certain kinds of issues, which are labeled as triggers. Those issues may be related to either being sleepy or being related to getting cuts, immobilization, getting cold, or being exposed to, let's say, darkness. It's maybe too dark, or you can't see too far. It could be foggy conditions, or there could be smoky conditions. So I would say this is kind of unfortunate, but in the mountain area, sometimes the smoke would blow over from a different part of Arizona. Maybe there might be a forest fire, or maybe that smoke may blow in from some town somewhere on the other side of the state, or in one of the other 4 states, the other 3 states actually, which is Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. So those 3 other states, they have all these heavy populations. They got cities and towns and such. So sometimes that smoke or fog or smog even may blow over by the wind and it may settle in the mountain area or in the valley. So that may occasionally, once in a while, cause visibility limitations. But not too often, I would say that. Why? Because in these areas where I'm talking about, which is isolated in the mountains, usually the weather is quite clear. It's usually pollution free. So that pollution that you would see usually comes from elsewhere, from the wind blowing it in. But you can overcome those issues by having a certain kind of light available if you want to go somewhere or you need to go down into the valley or do something like that to get moving. And also to see, let's say, to monitor animals from a distance. Because realistically, when you're living out in the woods, there could be groups of coyotes or wolves that wander around, and either bobcats or mountain lions that come through the area. And those kind of animals you really want to watch out for, and you want to see what they're up to at night, because well, if you have, let's say, some chickens or something, then they're most likely going to be drawn or attracted to those chickens. They're going to find some way to bother them or try to get them out so they can eat them. So if you can't see what's going on, then that's kind of hard. And if you have a light that cannot shine far enough, let's say a spotlight, or if the spotlight batteries do not last very long, then that may be something to take into consideration. So I will talk about laser-based flashlights to overcome some of those issues, because they are actually very bright and they're very efficient. And they allow you to see up to, say, 2 to 3 kilometers away very easily. And that's my experience in using them. So in terms of the daily baseline, there really is kind of like a set of tools that one could use. And I will actually mention some things like certain kinds of storage bags to keep things dry, so that if it gets snowy or rainy or anything like that, there's a storm and there happens to be a leak, you can actually keep these tools and even documents dry. And then the emergency extraction really is just about being able to move very quickly. And if you also need to help somebody, for example, who is, let's say, stuck somewhere, there's a very real possibility that someone will get stuck every couple of months. Someone gets stuck either in the mud or they get high centered or something. And to help them out, it's good to have some kind of emergency extraction tools with you so you can help them out. And then also self-awareness, because you never know, these folks are genuinely nice and genuinely lost, or if they're just playing tricks on you, because that's actually a real thing that happens out in the wilderness area. So that's a real thing to keep in mind. So in that regard, having these tools at least available with you, as well as different kind of radios that I will mention, these need to go with you. So now, the first item on the list are the gloves. There are 3 primary types that I have actually listed, and they are the work gloves, the wind and waterproof gloves, and there's a specific kind of glove. It's called a ski glove. You don't necessarily have to use it for skiing, but more as like an insulation glove. It's probably the next best thing to like a cryogenic glove that you would get. There is a cryogenic glove that exists, which is used for, let's say, handling liquid nitrogen or something like that. That's pretty extreme. But in this case, you actually could use something that's the next best thing, like I mentioned, which is a ski glove. That thing will actually help you to prevent yourself from getting like a frostbite, for example. So frostbite is a real thing that could happen. And then the other thing is hyperthermia. So these are two of some of the easiest things to get yourself exposed to, and it's not very pleasant, I'll tell you that, because in the end you end up losing parts of your limbs. But to prevent that, then you have a couple of special kind of gloves that are very easy to get. But this is not something that everyone thinks about, and as a result, they they end up hurting themselves. So work gloves, of course, that's just for general tool usage if you may need it. If you have calluses, that's great, but in some cases, you actually do need gloves because the whatever it is that you're working with may be actually very abrasive, or maybe have sharp objects, or in some cases, if you're trying to handle, let's say, you're trying to move a rattlesnake away from your house, for example. I've actually had this happen to me as well because there were rattlesnakes and a couple of other animals. Like there are lizards as well that run and chase folks. I've been chased by some of these lizards, and having a kind of glove, a really nice thick work glove, leather glove, to help you handle those animals and get them out of the area to a more isolated area, let them kind of manage themselves elsewhere, then that's good to have. Otherwise, uh, well, you could either get yourself poisoned or infected when you get bitten by these animals, and that's not good. So, um, in my childhood, I've had some close calls, but having these tools gave me the ability to take care of it myself. So, fortunately, I have not been bit in that regard. Okay, then the next one, of course, would be the jackets, for example. So I have windbreakers and parkas that are listed. So these are generally for keeping yourself from experiencing hypothermia in whether in extreme weather conditions or in just general rain. Because rain, for example, if you get your head wet, you could get sick. And if you don't have a waterproof hat or a waterproof beanie, for example, then that's not good because the rest of your body may be warm, but if your head is not warm and dry, then that's a big issue, and you don't want to put yourself in that scenario. So having some kind of waterproof gear and also something that's a windproof layer will keep that uh, cold condition from making things worse, because you do generally get or experience hypothermia a lot more quicker when there's wind blowing, uh, even when it's raining. And this happens especially at higher elevations, like where I live in the mountains, because those higher elevations basically expose you to a lot more harsher weather. Uh, and in that regard, when the rain comes, the rain's always going to be cold, even in the middle of summer. It could be like July and like late July even. And as soon as it rains, the temperature drops drastically and it gets kind of ice cold, and you could get yourself sick like that. So you you gotta have something waterproof and windproof. And then as soon as the wind comes, and especially if it's windy and rainy, it's kind of like a storm, then this thing will help you preserve yourself. And so also in that case, you could also pass this along to some folks, either in your household or possibly with friends or somebody that you may find stuck, for example. And then the other thing I like to talk about is the shoes. So the shoes, you actually could build kind of by yourself. You could actually make your own shoes. That's something always to consider, because there are stories, there are real life incidents where people do get stranded out in the wilderness area, and for some reason their shoes get stuck either in the snow, in the mud, and what have you. That also happened to me at one point. My boot got stuck in the mud, and uh, I had to get a shovel and hop on one foot and then dig out my boot. So, in much worse cases, uh, the boots that you're wearing, the shoes that you're wearing, actually could get stuck somewhere, and you won't be able to get very far with that. So, you end up injuring your feet or possibly getting close to like frostbite. So, at least having some kind of leather on you should allow you to improvise your own shoes. So improvising shoes like this will prevent you from experiencing frostbite in the longer term. So that's something I wanted to list here. And if you happen to have scissors with you, for example, there are portable scissors, then you could actually draw and outline your own shoes. Shoes are actually relatively easy to make by a certain kind of pattern. You draw it. If you know the relative area of your foot, you make that outline, then you can actually use the scissor to cut through a sheet of leather, and then you can actually fold this up or tie it together or sew it together, what have you. And then in that case, you have now improvised a shoe that will take you very far, even if you lost your primary one. So there's that. So of course, if you have some other shoes available somewhere, that's great. But they generally should be, like slip proof and such. Anyhow, I mentioned hats already here. It's more like a microclimate, so we'll just skip that part. And then more hats. You can check out this list later. Oh yeah, and then hats are also really good for preventing yourself from getting sunburnt in the hot sun. And then tweezers. So I mentioned tweezers here because there are many cases you actually would need it. For example, in my case, I've accidentally got myself stuck to a large array of thorns and needles, like cactuses, and it's very painful to get rid of. But there's a technique to actually take it off. So, in my experience, what you do is you take a tweezer, or at least if you have decent nails, then you could actually press the area closest to your skin, and then actually slowly extract the needle tip out of your skin. And if you have a tweezer, same thing. You press down on the skin, and then you pull out the needle, and it's actually less painful. If anything, in some cases you don't really feel much, but you now have effectively removed the barb or the needle from your skin, so that's good. So having this available is always good to have, and also splinters and among other things. So keep this in mind. And then if there are, let's say for example, maybe bites from certain animals, oh yes, don't disregard the possibility of even walking into some bees. So bees or even hornets. So that's happened to me myself. It's always good to keep in mind all of the larger structures that exist in an area, because if you happen to disturb some bees by accident, then what happens is they all come out of the hive and they start filling the area like a giant cloud of bees, and they start looking for things to sting. And if you get stung thousands of times, well, you're done. So in that case, to prevent yourself from doing that, keep this in mind. However, you may get stung a couple of times. So if that happens, this is good to be able to take out of your skin and then treat yourself. And then also there should be some like antibiotics or petroleum jelly or something of that nature to help you recover. So, and that's about it, yeah, for that section. And then the thermals, I think I already mentioned this. This is just kind of like the practical details of the little quote-unquote microclimate that is around your body. And then this is also the practical detail that talks about why it is better to put the more insulating layers on the bottom, and then the more windproof and waterproof layers on the outside. So you can have a look at that here. You can also read it in the slides that I will make available. They're already available on GitHub, but it's just I wanted to outline that a little bit. And then these are the strategies to kind of keep in the back of the mind if you have good memory. If you don't have good memory, then maybe write it down somewhere. And then the classification tree for those layers to make it reiterated here. This should make it a little bit easier. You could even screenshot the tree if you'd like. So here we go. And then the knives portion. So I mentioned that there are at least two different kinds of knives to be able to use in this case, because one knife is really good at cutting, let's say, vegetables, fruits, maybe some kind of meats, and it's pretty good for that. Or maybe even paper. Who knows? But it's mostly used for vegetables and meat cutting. So that's good for that. But if you try to use that thin blade, trying to attempt at cutting, let's say, a sheet of metal, then it's not very effective. Let's say you forgot your can opener. Let's say you had a can and you wanted to open it, but there's there's not a lot of options. Maybe your can opener is somewhere else, or you lost it, or you don't have one. Then you could actually use a thicker blade knife. So the blade of the knife actually can puncture through a thicker blade that is can puncture through the sheet of steel that the can is made of, and then you can actually use that to open it, and then make cuts section by section, and boom, it's open. I would demonstrate that, but we don't have time for that today. Maybe in another recording. So either way, this is my personal experience, and it's been pretty effective. So that's pretty much all you need for blades. But for scissors, I mentioned them here because, like I said, you could actually use them to cut sheets of leather. You can use them to cut a couple of other things. And in some cases, there are kind of like utility scissors that one could use to cut, let's say, sheets of steel or sheets of aluminum, for example. So those do exist, but it's a kind of a case-by-case basis in this case. If you want to do some kind of repair project on your own, but that's really up to you. That's optional. That's why I did not include it here in the base levels of gear. But the other part is the wrench. So there are the wrenches listed here that you could use. I will not talk too much about this because it's pretty straightforward. But let's see. Same thing with pliers, different kind of pliers that I mentioned, and then chisels and such. So we're gonna head and skip that. Leather sheets. Okay, so in terms of the leather usage I was talking about, the repairs you could use it for, and sort of the improv kind of pouches, tools, other kinds of wear, they are listed here already. So the other thing I did not mention were like kind of like non-slip mats. You actually could use them for that. In fact, there are some jackets that do come with a kind of special hood that goes over the shoulders, and those can be removed and used as a replacement for that. So I have a jacket that happens to contain this kind of feature. And if you happen to be working on the ground and looking for something to, let's say, either start a fire or maybe gather kindling or do something on the ground that requires, maybe the ground might be a little bit wet, and if you have your knees on the ground and it's slightly moist, it will actually create this damp area on your pants, and it's not very comfortable. And it could even get mud on there, so that's not great. So having this mat available, like a makeshift mat, is something that is good to have. So, and then other things that you could make out of it are things like simple straps and even handles. You could actually make a really quick handle using that if you need it. It's kind of a quick solution for something. And then the other ideal solution for that would be a kind of adhesive and tape. I have listed actually just 3 kinds of tape that are really good for these kind of living situations. And the first one is based on a kind of cloth. It's called gaffer tape. And these kind of tapes are not very sticky. They're considered low residue tapes, but they are pretty effective as either labels or simple temporary handles or something of that nature. But it's good to have. And then the other type would be a kind of reinforced butyl rubber tape. So this tape is kind of like a thick layer of really semi-rigid rubber. And the adhesives that comes with this kind of tape are actually so good that you could use it as a kind of leak repair mechanism. So if there is either a leak in a low pressure pipe or a low pressure, let's say a leak, let's say by chance you had a leak in a roof, for example, then you actually could use this kind of special tape for that purpose. And in most cases, these kind of tapes are actually weather resistant. They are able to withstand certain levels of UV radiation directly and certain temperature ranges as well, to some extent. Because I understand, according to some accounts, not all kinds of rubber tape are, at least the adhesive for the rubber tapes, are going to last in, let's say, the extreme Arizona sun. So this is something to just keep in mind. But if you keep it out of the direct sunlight, I would say that's more ideal. If you're going to use it in sunlight, you may have to find a way to cover it at least. But for the temporary, at least for the temporary solutions, if it's going to be in the sun, then it'll work just fine. But this is the best I could put together. The third one would happen to be Gorilla Tape. The reason why I mention this is because it's better than duct tape than regular duct tape. It's a lot stronger. It's essentially duct tape, but it's like a stronger version. Has a much higher tensile strength, among other things, and you could use it for structural wraps. Duct tape, on the other hand, let's just say to put it in practical terms, it's like half as strong. So pick something stronger. And then, in terms of ropes, I mentioned I put toe straps here because they are strong. You may not necessarily need to tow anything, but for actually handling heavy objects or heavy duty items that need to be tied down, or maybe you need to tie something to a rock, or by chance you actually do need to pull something that's like as heavy as a vehicle, then yeah, sure, this is good to have. It's the next best thing to a chain, but not everyone's going to carry a chain with them. This is a decent solution, and a lot of these kind of straps are actually weather resistant or weatherproof, and they can withstand lots of UV radiation according to the rating. And then I actually put a table here that you could observe by section. There's an item, strength, and constraints that come with each of these kind of ropes and straps. So just have a look at these, and then you should have a really good idea of what to do with those if you need it. But it's better to know that if you will or may need it than to not have seen this table. Let's put it that way. And then the floodlights, I already mentioned here, it's pretty much just being able to see a larger area. But if you want to see farther, then generally speaking, especially in summertime, the floodlight is not going to allow you to see very far. It's better to see something with more of a collimated beam, such as a white laser flashlight, like what I have here. So this thing right here is capable of doing so. And in my experience, I would say, like I said, the spotlight, it is okay. It's just that it drains a lot of battery, and I don't always have battery power available in the woods, especially at night. So that was a problem in my case. But in modern times, you see, battery capacities are a lot better, and they have much more capabilities, like this USB-C, which I will talk about soon. But this is good to have for being able to see late into the night. And then you can also read these details here. I talk about the extreme emergency conditions for the usage of lasers, because in realistic scenarios, people do get lost in the woods and in the canyon area sometimes. And when that happens and people lose radio contact or phone contact, like the signal just does not work whatsoever, then the next best thing you have to that, I would say, is a laser. You could use a flashlight, but sometimes a flashlight is not bright enough or not effective enough, or maybe it's dead. Flashlights die quite often, I would say. But again, more effective in this case would be a laser. Normally, in most cases, for the usage of lasers, um, it's not legal to point it at like let's say aircraft or law enforcement or anything like that. But if there ever comes a case, which does happen, in which there is an imminent threat of death or like severe maiming, or like maybe you're extremely stuck or stranded, and maybe you're, let's say maybe your foot gets stuck in something, or you're crushed, maybe one of your limbs get crushed or something. This can't happen. Then if you have you happen to have a laser on you, that will actually get you out of that pinch. Someone will notice that laser from miles away. I guarantee it. You could shine this laser at a vehicle or aircraft from like 10, 20, 30 miles away, and they'd actually be able to see it because lasers actually can travel that far and even further. The Especially for like blue, green, yellow kind of lasers, they go really far. So just keep this in mind. And then I put the regulatory compliance notes here. So of course these always have to be mentioned. So there's that. And then the other very simple but useful thing is a magnifying glass. So this thing right here, it may be useful for, let's say, getting or helping you to remove splinters, look at smaller details that may not require a microscope. And in this case, it will also help you with looking at small mechanical details. I don't know, it could be a watch. Let's say you did something with your watch and you're trying to repair it by yourself or something. You could use a magnifying glass to help you with that. But the other great thing about magnifying glasses is that you could actually use it to ignite a fire starter, or like, tinders of wood, and then kablam, you have yourself a nice fire. So there's that, um, among other things. So the rest of the details, you can see that in the list there. And then the other one is, I think, very important, the use of binoculars. And there's a specific kind of binocular that one needs to take into consideration. This one is called a 70 by 50 capable, or should I say, long eye relief. So the term here is called long eye relief binoculars. So these kind of binoculars basically help you to select, or should I say, it allows you to look through the binocular without experiencing things like eye strain. It helps you to not experience motion sickness. So if you're someone like me, for example, who cannot work with microscopes or binoculars for very long because there's a lot of motion going on, then like specifically through a lens, then in that case, having this kind of binocular is good to have. And in such cases, you might be using a binocular for a long time. In my case, my hard limit is about 1 hour. If I use it beyond 1 hour, then it starts to turn my stomach. But if you have a long eye relief binocular, then this will actually allow you to use the binocular for much more than that. You can use it for the whole day, and you'd feel just fine, no problems. So this is something I recommend for sure if you are going to get your gear together out in the woods. And it also helps you to look ahead of trails, among other things. If you want to check what animals are doing out in the wilderness, then this is good to look for as well. Because sometimes animals can really blend in with the environment. And if you want to kind of see where they are ahead of time so that you don't either surprise them or anything like that, then this is good to have. This one is really more of an upgrade than this next slide here. I put thermal camera. This is more modern. It's because I happen to have a thermal camera myself. It's just that it's so useful in helping to identify leaks. If there's a lot of heat coming out of an enclosure, could be in a building, could be through a roof, could be through, I don't know, could help you diagnose electronics, even small electronics work. You can see where all of the heat is going, And the added bonus is it's kind of a cheap way of uh, getting like night vision, because now with the heat camera, the thermal camera, you can see certain kinds of animals in the nighttime without necessarily being able to see them with your naked eye. You can see them through the heat vision. So in that case, it's extremely useful if you happen to own certain kind of livestock or chickens or something of that nature. You can see where they are coming, and you can see also even where their trails are located, because a lot of these kind of animals, they have certain kind of patterns that they like to follow in the woods, and if you can track them down and know where they're coming from, then you could locate that yourself using this aided tool. But that's optional, it's not required. It's just something I felt was worth mentioning. And then, of course, the standard first aid toolkit. There is the bandages, the acetaminophen, the cough syrup, the I believe I put petroleum jelly here somewhere. But actually, yeah. So if you do happen to know the history of petroleum jelly, I mean, it's not written here, but it did come originally from uh, these oil wells that had these buildup of this really what do you call it? Well, it's like a thick oily substance. It's where that petroleum jelly comes from. But it turns out by chance that substance actually was really good for the skin, and people would actually use it to help kind of patch up bruises or abrasions on their skin in the workplace. So, simply because of this chance that it happened to be useful, someone happened to think of perhaps studying it a bit closer and then possibly using it for medical purposes. And then someone did, and that's where petroleum jelly came from. And so now here it is. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. It's also very cheap, and you can also get large containers of it as well to help you with first aid. Skin abrasions, small cuts, things like that. So that's what that's good for. And by chance, it is also somewhat good for like really dried conditions. So, for example, if you are in the Arizona mountain area, then winter time can get extremely dry. Even though Arizona itself is already dry, but in winter it's even drier. It gets close to zero, like 10% and below humidity rate levels. So it even dips below 10%, even close, like I said, close to zero. So that's really dry. And that kind of dryness of air actually can dry up your skin when you're outside for too long. And in my experience, it dries up the backside of the hand a lot faster, and also the lips and the nose, and I think maybe certain parts of the cheekbones in that area. So this part gets really dried up, and the skin starts to get all crusty, and it's not very a pleasant experience. And plus, it starts to bleed if it gets worse, just from being dry. So not great, but you can possibly battle that using petroleum jelly. And for your gloves, um, latex gloves actually are really effective at preventing your hands from getting extremely dry in this kind of conditions. So that's kind of why I mentioned that on here as a side note. Okay, so and then the typical hygiene modules. Here we go. This part I mentioned the terrible microfiber cloth. I actually happen to have some here with me. It's very simple, but the reason why I really like it is because it happens to be reusable, and you could actually trash it if you wanted to. And the other great thing about microfiber cloths is that you could use it to clean optical lenses. So if you have glasses like me, for example, and you got spare glasses, you got binoculars, you got things like that, then it's not always easy to find something to clean those lenses to really good optical quality. So having some microfiber cloth, at least it's in a roll that's terrible, then you could actually use it for that purpose. And on top of that, it is also useful for uh, putting soap on it and using it, I mean, soap and hot water and using it to clean up a surface to make it bacteria free, or at least almost bacterial free, bacteria free. So it's really good at removing things like that because of how small the fibers are on these cloths. And then the liquid mints. This one is a bit special to me because this is something that you do not typically see in any kind of knowledge repository or knowledge sharing like this. I mention this because in my use case, I happen to use liquid mint to deter. Well, it's a concentrated, camphor and eucalyptus mint, and this mint is capable of repelling pests. Could be mice, rats, insects, even larger animals. So it really depends on how much you have, and the higher the amount, the higher volume that you have. I believe it has something to do with the. I mean, I've done research on it, but I don't want to go too much into the details. It has to do with the chemical makeup of these plants. And in higher concentrations, they're a little bit more like neurotoxins, but in smaller concentrations, they are actually really good for either skin or for helping to get some breathability, things like that. So in that regard, I would say this may also be useful for maybe larger pests as well, if it comes to that. So so in my case, there happened to be a specific kind of mice or mouse population that lived in the area where I grew up, and you cannot really take any risk on this because these populations of deer mice are capable of transmitting hantavirus. Hantavirus is not good or safe. You cannot take any chances on being exposed to hantavirus. What happens is it gets airborne through dust particles, and this could also happen when the feces of these deer mouse populations dries up inside of dusty places, inside of enclosures, inside of closets, tool sheds, things like that. And when that feces of the mouse of these mice dries up and it starts getting into the dust of the air, and you breathe it in, then you could get hantavirus, and you experience a really extreme form of pneumonia. It's like pneumonia kind of conditions, and then it fills your lungs up with fluid, and then within a period of about roughly 3 or 4 days, you pretty much just die in your sleep. So there are small epidemics that have happened in Arizona, New Mexico, kind of in that area, because of these mice populations. So when I see these mice populations, my solution to that is the liquid mint. It actually does work on them, and even in higher concentrations, it does it does get rid of them. So there's that. But if you don't want to kill the mice, that's fine. Just make sure you're not exposed to that. And the way you can prevent yourself from exposure is by repelling them, by perhaps putting these mint plants or the concentrated version of the mint itself around one's living space. And then the other part is the thermos. This is pretty straightforward. This is just general insulation for hot and cold liquids. But the metal cup and Pyrex bowl I mentioned, this is also useful. Why? Because you can expose them to flame as long as there's liquid in there. Metal cup, I think you could use it without any kind of liquid in it, but that kind of defeats the purpose anyway. Borosilicate glass, the Pyrex glass, for example, you could use it for cooking, for example, but it's just only thing is it needs to have some kind of liquid in it, at least kind of like water, to be able to tolerate flames directly. So otherwise, it will just crack open if there's no liquid in it. So there's that. Either way, it's a little bit easier to clean compared to plastic because plastic bowls are not really. They get scratched up, and if it gets too hot, it may melt, and also, you know, comes with that risk. So another thing to consider is the Sawyer type water filters. So these water filters have these kind of hollow fibers in them. There's tiny micron scale fibers in them that provide a physical form of filtration. And this filtration allows you to even drink from streams and similar kinds of water sources, and even possibly springs, because we have springs where we live, but those springs are pretty clean. And the way we usually clean or prepare them for drinking, in our case, is we boil them in a pot. That's pretty much how we do it. We never really use water filters like this, of this sort. So in our case, first of all, the spring water is already filtered through the rocks themselves. These are, sandstone, feldspar, certain kinds of granite. They already do the filtration by themselves, but it doesn't hurt to boil them. And in that case, it's pretty good, and it tastes great. That's the other thing. The water out where I live, in this case, actually tastes very, 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 very good. It's a unique kind of flavor and a unique kind of taste as well. You can go to any part of the U.S., any part of the world. It's very difficult to find a water of that kind of quote unquote flavor, but this is something you could take with you as well. Let's see here, power. Okay, power architecture. So this part, I mentioned that there is a kind of battery that does have a USB-C on it, like what I have here, this 21700 battery. This USB-C feature does allow you to charge it with the USB-C, but you could also use the USB-C to charge something else from the battery. So that's great. But if you have, let's say, a 12 pack or something of this nature, maybe 20 pack or 16 pack, that's great. But you could also think about having at least a 12 volt seal lead acid or LiFePO4. Preferably, you should use a LiFePO4 because in modern times, this is a lot more stable. It lasts longer. It can, I believe, it can also charge faster to some extent, and it's a lot more climate friendly to some extent. Again, seal lead acid. If you have no choice, then well, that's available. I happen to have one, but I would like to upgrade to LiFePO4. 12 volts electronics are, in this scenario of living in the wilderness, I would say it's a good option to have, because if you don't have electricity, then you got solar power. This 12 volt pack will take you pretty far. You actually could plug it into an inverter even if you happen to need 120 volt AC to a certain wattage level, maybe 400 or probably 800, 850, something of that nature. But you should not necessarily bring yourself to the point where you actually need thousands of watts, continuously all the time. That, I don't think that's stable. In my experience, I never use that much electricity in the woods, so this is stable enough, and also it keeps the cost down. Is the other thing. So it helps you to prevent yourself from needing to expend all of this resource that you have, which may be limited, and then also the energy storage level may not last as long if you're using too much. So if you stick with something that's a little bit lower powered, more energy efficient, it's better that way. So in this case, there are comparisons that I drew up in a table. You can have a look at this table yourself, look at the details, and those will be available. And then the two-way radio, I kind of made some comments about this already. So generally, when you are living in the mountains, two-way radio is pretty standard to have, simply because having a phone will not always work. There are certain places you could go that the phone may work, but there's no guarantee. And why? Because it's kind of a line of sight constraint. And then also the two-way radio, even though it's the next best thing, that in itself may or may not work, either due to limitations in the range of the radio, even if it's long range, or maybe because of a lack of a repeater tower. Let me see. Or maybe the battery's dead. And there's no battery available for the radio, or the battery dies, or something like that while you're using it. Could be the case. But at least having something like this available will put you in a more, or should I say, less stressed state of mind. Because really, people get anxiety and stress and worry because they feel like they're not prepared for anything. But if you are prepared, if you have the tools available, you should be fine. No worries. So these, again, this is nothing too extreme. These are acceptable, these are realistic, and they already exist. So there's that. We're talking about redundancy. We're talking about having kind of an engineering mindset when it comes to keeping yourself sustained in the mountains, as I have. Okay, so this hybrid module that I mentioned here is just something that I would recommend because of the power efficiency that you could use with the X1 Extreme. But I don't think I mentioned the inverter. There's no inverter mentioned here, but you could just select whatever inverter you feel is necessary to power this. So other than that, slider storage bags. This one is also one of my very important, pieces of wisdom I like to share. It's because slider bags are really good at organizing smaller objects, but you could also use slider bags if they're large enough. You could fit a laptop in them, and the laptop essentially becomes protected from moisture and dust. Problem solved. I learned this myself because one time I was riding my bike to some place. I had my laptop in the bag. The bag is not waterproof at the time, but when I was coming back, there was like a kind of like a flash flood or like a flash storm of sorts, and it started downpouring rain. I rode through that rain. It trenched through my laptop, to the bag, to the laptop, and then laptop was dead. So I had to replace the motherboard, among other things, and I wasn't too bummed out about it, but it's just really inconvenience. So either way, it turns out that one way you could prevent yourself from experiencing that is actually just to carry a large enough slider bag. It's kind of like a Ziploc bag, but you're able to slide. It uses a sliding mechanism. So that's pretty much it. And they're not expensive. They're pretty cheap. So that's good to have. And then you could also put other things in it that you need to keep dry, like batteries, first aid, and other like ignition tools, kindlings, things like that. So that's good for that. Documents. Okay, and then you can also use this maintenance schedule as well as a kind of realistic inspiration for your needs. And then this is kind of like a summary of the emergency extraction modules should you need to help a friend, help somebody, or if you need to move yourself from one place to the next. In the cases of a storm, whether if it's a winter storm, windstorm, rainstorm, what have you. Hopefully, not a mudslide, but this is good to have. So keep that with you. And then this is just a kind of upgrade trigger. I already talked about these upgrades as we went along, but this is put in a table form, and that's about. Let me see. We're getting actually very close to the end. This section here is really just alternative ways to be able to, let's say, produce a fire. This one is more on the rechargeable side, but in some extreme scenarios, you actually could use a battery, for example. If you happen to have a battery, even a AA battery, and then you could use a constricted piece of, let's say, aluminum, or even a gum wrapper that has aluminum on it, and you can use that to start a fire. That's it. It doesn't even have to be a high powered battery. It just needs to be about 1.5 volts at least, and that will start a fire. I've done it. I ran out of matches one time, and I started some fires that way, and then kept myself warm all night. So, and then the cooking section. I already mentioned this. Shovel tools. Okay, yeah. So this is already mentioned, but these are some additional details to help maintain yourself. And then other tools that require any kind of structural work, or that are going to be applied to structural work. You can have these notes. And then this one, I would say, is also kind of my personal input. This one is a foldable mini table. I have one, and these tables are also pretty cheap. These tables, you can kind of carry them almost like a backpack, and they are very useful to be able to do work on. Let's say you have nowhere to sit, you have nowhere to like put down a laptop or put down some documents to write on. Then having this foldable table that will actually collapse into kind of like a cylinder, a rudimentary cylinder, actually is very useful. So these do exist, and well, I actually was inspired by an uncle of mine. He had one of these, and they used it in his work as a surveyor. So I was like, yo, I need to get one of these. Let me see. So I happen to have one, and I do occasionally use it. So there's that. But if I was in the woods today, I would use it a lot more often. In Utah, I had one, and I actually did use it to do a lot of my homework and paperwork wherever I wanted to do work. I didn't have to search for tables or anything like that around campus or anything regarding studying. But this is in the context of studying. If you wanted to do it for work, it is also very, very useful. In fact, arguably more useful. And you could even use it to set up tools on there because they're pretty stable. Let me see. And then here's the rest of the layout. You could use this layout for yourself if you'd like. This is more kind of like an optional decision table. And then the 21700 batteries, this one I already mentioned. This is just kind of going through the list. And then this one I would consider kind of an upgrade. Normally, a kind of solar panel would be more rigid, and it's hard to carry. It's not easy to move in terms of like actually transporting it. So there are foldable variations available of solar panels that even go beyond 100 watts. The reason why I mentioned 100 watts is because it happens to be enough power for the X1 Extreme that I mentioned, but it's also good enough to charge all of these other devices that I mentioned, which are not very power-hungry devices. These are just useful for that. And 100-watt folding solar panels actually can collapse to an area about the size of a book, or maybe even the size of my Surface Pro 10 that I'm using here. So these kind of panels are collapsible, and you can carry them like a book. I think that's probably one of the neatest things about foldable technology is how portable and useful it is. So there are some folks who actually do use this for charging their electric bike batteries or mountain bike batteries, for example. That's something a bit more modern of a use case, but still, I think it's very neat. But let me see here. These are the kind of things that it could charge. I already mentioned that here, but this is a nice table you can use as a reference. And then the pen, I mentioned a ballpoint pen here because if you happen to have that in the gear setup, then it happens to be pretty durable in terms of its build quality, but on average. But at the same time, it is useful under a wide range of temperatures and humidities. And for some certain kinds of pens, that's not always guaranteed. So uh, do keep this in mind. And then more details about the slider storage bags. And then the terrible microfiber cloths, I already commented on this and its optical capabilities or optical care capabilities, and also even medical cleanup. That's the other thing. Why? Because it's capable of grabbing onto the bacteria and the smaller organisms of that size. Okay, and then water treatments. I did kind of mention this, but this one you can read yourself. You generally do want to avoid, let's say, if you are trying to clean some water yourself. In my case, we generally do avoid algae blooms, which are mentioned here. You actually do encounter this in the woods, but you generally just want to move away from it. There are other sources of water out there that do not have algae blooms. And if you can find those, then the method to handle those in order to make them clean are mentioned here in terms of filtration and so forth. So, and then some technical details about the white laser flashlight are mentioned here. But in my case, like I said, it actually goes to, well, at least this flashlight specifically that I have goes up to like 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers away, and it's really far. So very useful. And then here's the rest of the acronyms if you want to check that out. But there you go, and we're finally done. And this is all Creative Commons licensed, so feel free to enjoy and consume the information. All right.